How debilitating is bad defense, and how far can a good defense take you? Those questions I will try and answer, and some people may think they already know the answers, and you may well know the answers, but I thought it'd be interesting to dive into the stats behind that and see really how truly debilitating a bad defense is and how good a good defense is for taking you all the way. There are two reasons why I wanted to look at this. You may know the Raiders were historically bad on defense in the first 2 weeks of the season and still rank last in total defense after a better week 3 showing. Now, plenty of people were hot on the Raiders coming into the season, myself included, and the offense has lived up to the hype. The O-line has now been talked as one of the best in the league, and they currently have the second ranked rushing offense, and this was a team that was 5th worst in rushing last year. They also ranked second in total offense and have a top 10 scoring offense. At 2-1, they still have over a 50% chance of making the playoffs, so I wanted to know how far have teams in this century gone with the worst defense in the league, and to find that out I looked at both the worst total and worst scoring defenses. And the second reason were the Green Bay Packers. They currently have allowed a tiny 42.7 rushing yards per game, and now obviously that won't be their end of season number, but that got me looking at some of the best rushing defenses this century to see how far the Packers could go off the back of a defense like that. So let's start with the Raiders, or as a matter of fact, any team not doing too hot defensively right now, such as the worst scoring Buccaneers defense. Just how far can you go dragging that with you, and what exactly does it take to overcome a terrible D? Well, the outlook isn't great, and of course remember this is week 3, so those defenses that currently rank last won't necessarily rank last by the end of the season. For example, the Chiefs and Rams were last in points allowed after week 3 in 2011 and 2013 respectively, but both finished the season in the top half of the league in those categories. But let's say the Raiders do finish last in total defense at the end of the season. Can they still make the playoffs? The short answer is it's not impossible, but it's also not promising. Out of the 28 teams that have ranked last in either yards or points this century, only 2 teams have made the playoffs. The average record for the worst scoring defense has been 4-12, and the average for the worst total defenses is 6-10. So what about those 2 playoff teams? Surely they offer hope to the Raiders, right? Or any other team that finishes last but has a good offense. Once again, yes and no. It is true that you can make the playoffs with the worst defense in the NFL, but there is one common trend amongst these 2 teams that makes you think twice about how possible it is. In 2000, the Rams did make the playoffs despite having the worst scoring defense, but they also had NFL MVP Marshall Faulk on their offense. The other team were the 2011 Packers, who went 15-1 despite having the worst total defense in the league, but again, they had the NFL MVP Aaron Rodgers on their offense. The only 2 teams to have made the playoffs this century despite fielding league worst defenses also had that season's NFL MVP on offense. So Raiders fans, it's time to start crossing those fingers for Derek Carr or Latavius Murray. More importantly though, both teams went out in their first playoff game that year. The outlook's not great. The outlook is better, however, if the Raiders, or any other team, move up 1 spot by the end of the season to second worst defense. In 2011, the team that was worst in yards after week 3 was also 2-1 after week 3, just like the Raiders. That team, the New England Patriots, ended the season with the second worst defense and went on to make it all the way to the Super Bowl, but just fell shy of the ultimate goal. So the moral of the story is, if you have the worst defense in the league, you are going nowhere, but if it's only the second worst, you could make it all the way to the Super Bowl. 2011 offers promise to teams with bad defenses. The 2 teams in the Super Bowl had the 31st and 27th ranked defenses in the league. So bad defense doesn't make anything impossible, however league worst pretty much signs your playoff death warrant. And now a word of warning to the Saints. The Saints are currently second worst in points allowed and are yet to win a game. The only team to go back-to-back seasons this century with the worst scoring defense in the league went 0-16 in the second year of holding that honor. This would be the Saints' second year as the worst scoring defense. Now, the Lions of 2008 did actually go 3 years back to back as the worst overall defense in the league in both yards and points, and no other team has gone back to back in yards, so maybe it's the yards allowed that causes the 0-16, or it's just terrible front office work, or it's a terrible coach, or it's terrible players, but you never know. Enough of bad defenses. We know that defense wins championships, or at least we know it's a popular saying, So what's the forecast for the 2016 Packers and their league-leading rushing defense? Of course, again, this is only after week 3, but humor me here as we look at some of the best defenses, because as it stands right now, by the end of the season, the Packers would have only allowed 100 yards more than the 1942 Bears, who allowed the least rushing yards in a single season, and they only played 11 games. The 16-game record is held by the historic 2000 Ravens defense at 970, but let's just say they remain in first place, not that they destroy records held by what I and many others believe to be the greatest defense of all time. Rather than staying in first place, what they actually need to do is keep their total rushing yards allowed per game under 70 yards. So let's look at the 21st century, where only 4 teams have kept opponents to under 70 rushing yards per game. Out of those 4 teams, one, the Ravens, won a Super Bowl, the 2010 Steelers went to the Super Bowl but lost, the other 2 were the 2006 Vikings, who only allowed 1 more yard per game than the Ravens, but they went 6-10 and didn't even make the playoffs, and the 2014 Lions, who went 11-5 after allowing 69.3 yards but went out in the wildcard round. Still, this gives the Packers, statistically, if they keep their average below 70 yards, a 50% chance of making the Super Bowl and a 75% chance of making the playoffs, which is the same chance as starting the season 3-0. That second one is probably more accurate than the first one. The stat is of course misleading because nothing gives you a 50% chance of making the Super Bowl. Okay, actually that's not true. In fact, there is something that gives you a 50% chance of winning the Super Bowl, and that's having 9 Hall of Famers on the same team at the same time for an 8-year period. The Steelers between 1974 and 1981 had 9 Hall of Famers on the same roster at the same time, as well as a Hall of Fame coach and owner, so make that 11, and during that 8-year period they won 4 Super Bowls. So here's some more facts about having 9 Hall of Famers on one team. You have a 63% chance of making the conference title game, and you have an 80% chance of winning that title game. You have a 100% chance of winning the Super Bowl if you're in it, but oddly enough you also have a 25% chance of completely missing out on the playoffs, which the Steelers did for the final 2 years of the period before a couple of players left and they no longer had 9 Hall of Famers on the team. Okay, so that's all completely irrelevant. To bring it back to the original point, if the Packers keep opposing teams under 70 yards rushing per game, expect to see them in the playoffs. Chances are you already expected to see them in the playoffs, and that's how stats work. They just tend to point out the pretty obvious.